So much for tuning in to Morning Live. Now, 20 years after recommendations contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, which was handed over to the now ruling government, numbers of victims and families are still waiting for justice. And some of the proposals included the prosecution of 300 perpetrators of apartheid, and the victims of those crimes had to be financially compensated among some of the recommendations contained. And just recently, the National Prosecuting Authority announced that it would reopen 15 cases for prosecution, which, of course, is only a drop in the ocean compared to the hundreds that were mentioned in the report. And judging from our discussion on this matter yesterday, the decades-long delay of this process has brought years of pain for victims and for their families. And to discuss this matter further, we join now by Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, who's a former TRC Commissioner and also head of the Commission's Investigative Unit, as well as Dr Marjorie Jobson, a National Director of the Khulumani Support Group. Thank you so much to both of you for coming through this morning.
Yes,
thank you, King. I want to start here, Advocate Ntsebeza, by quoting verbatim from the report, because you had the entire TRC process. It was open for all to see, witness, hear what actually went on. People had either applied, not applied for amnesty. We went through that entire process, and in the end, there was a 46-page dossier of recommendations that was handed over, along with the recommendation that some 300 cases be prosecuted. But then let's just look at what the actual reading from that report said. It said, where amnesty has not been sought or has been denied, prosecution should be considered.
Yes.
One would think that that is simple enough to understand. So how do we find ourselves 20 years on from then, where we still have not seen any sort of impetus on the side of government to actually follow through on these recommendations?
Well, I suppose the government of the day has to make a lot of explanation as to why they didn't follow that recommendation. I think I've been saying for the last, 20 years, that there was, at some stage, or right from the beginning, there was lack of political will. And that is, a thin edge of the wedge. Because when once, government of the day, which is accountable, doesn't do things that they ought to do, then, everybody then begins to think that they can do anything with impunity. I say this because we now know from a deposition that was made by Mrs. Nkadimeng and a deposition that was made by a member of the National Department of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Ackerman, Advocate Ackerman, that they were specifically told by ministers of state that they should not prosecute any of these TRC-related cases. Now, that's an affidavit. That was the affidavit that was filed in court when we were applying, when, Mrs. Nkadimeng, who's an ANC member, was applying for the prosecution of the murderers of Nokuthula Simelane, her sister, who just disappeared.
Mrs. Nkadimeng is the mayor of Polokwane.
That is the one.
Yes, but were you surprised by that, Advocate Ntsebeza, considering the application that was brought on the eve of the handover of the report by President Thabo Mbeki?
That's exactly the point. And I mean, what saddened me about that incident, I mean, it was literally on the eve of our handing the report. And we were already here in Johannesburg where it was going to happen. And we had to spend the whole night opposing that application. And it was on a flimsy basis because they did not want the public, or they did not want the publication of a Commission of Inquiry's report where they had been given an ample opportunity to come and make representations as to why we should make the findings that we had made. We had made findings about the ANC and their conduct, both inside and outside, in the context of what the TRC was all about. And it was extraordinary. And we had this situation where President Mandela, who was the president of the country, was waiting for us to present the commission to him. And President Mbeki was the president of the ANC, who had just been elected as president of the ANC, was spearheading the bringing of an application in court to prevent us presenting the TRC report to the president of the country, who is also the outgoing president of the ANC. It was extraordinary, it was surreal. And there it was.
It brings us to the point where we are today. Evidently, still no political will to follow through for whatever reasons there may be. But it was about the people, or at least it was supposed to be, Dr. Marjorie Jobson, about bringing to light those gross human rights violations perpetrated against victims here in this country. And one of the things that you have also been saying over the years is that this was once again the tip of the iceberg.
Sakina, I think given that the National Gender-Based Violence Summit is starting today under the auspices with major support from SAWD, South African Women in Dialogue, which has been a brainchild of Mrs. Zanele Mbeki, and all the evidence of their work over these last something like 10 years, and they've just completed dialogues in every province. The issue that is top of the agenda is we haven't made peace with our past. We haven't dealt with the wounding of people. We haven't got the truth. And so we've gone right back full circle to a place now where there are demands that we go and do this finally. And for everybody, that is the way we can build the new dawn. I mean, it's a major part of a new dawn. And we're very grateful that this week with our advocacy, that the recommendations have never been wholeheartedly embraced by the state. This TRC was actually a groundbreaking innovation worldwide. It was recognized, it is still recognized, but the flaw has been the lack of any follow-on and proper implementation. And so we finally got a concession from the TRC unit that we have to go back to the drawing board and now write the proper policy on how to do reparation and reconciliation so we can finally build real peace based on truth and justice and the restoration of people's dignity. So I would love to involve all the listeners and watchers of the program in understanding the struggle in a way is in another phase. We have a chance to offer opportunities for people to tell the truth. Just this week, because we're part of the action to prosecute people, just this week we are getting calls from former security branch officers saying, oh, they've got a file on what happened to Neil Agate, and they've got files that they've never disclosed. They never came clean, but they don't want to come open. They want to sell what they've got. And we hear from Wits historical papers that there are records in people's garages all over the country that would actually properly give us the basis of what we've been trying to put in place, which for us, I mean, one of our former chairperson was a very strong advocate of decolonization, and he is now saying it's based on reparation, rehabilitation, and restitution. And if we can now break new ground all over again and do those things with a proper policy and not just ad hoc committees as happened in Parliament, everything related to the follow-on to the TRC became an ad hoc committee. So we're sitting now with people who are wanting presidential pardons, but all of that pardon process was decided by ad hoc committees with no minutes. You can't get minutes of their meetings. And we never did the follow-on systematically and honouring what an innovation the TRC had been.
But how do we then now, 20 years on since those recommendations, that report was handed over, break new ground when seemingly very little has changed in terms of that political will to move forward?
I think the problem with South African civil society organizations has been that, you know, they assumed that when once we had conquered apartheid and we're now in a democracy, that there was no need for them to play the kind of role that they had always played, to be the watchdogs. And it has been left to organizations like Khulumani, Maji's organization, you know, to rally. people around certain of these things that have not been honored by our government by way of of implementing some of the recommendations that we had said. I mean, for instance, let's take the question of reparations. We recommended that at least those victims or survivors that had been identified by the process, and I mean, it was not even a complete list. In fact, Marjie's organization has come up with a very comprehensive list over the years. But we had identified a particular list of people who were survivors or victims. And we said, as far as we are concerned, not as a compensation, but as something to restore the dignity of the people who had come forward, who had laid bare their soul to the TRC, and therefore we felt that they were survivors or victims who needed to be given reparations. We recommended about 2,000 rand a month for about 6 years. I mean, that was not compensation for some of the horrors that those people had gone through. But this government kicked that in the teeth.
It was supposed to be
we calculated. In fact, with Stephen Malulan, and one of the recommendations that we had made was say 1% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange companies, let's impose that 1%, once of 1%, of their market capitalization. Now, Stephen Maluland, I think, was writing for the Sign Term, did a calculation and he said, I cannot believe that the ANC didn't implement this, because by and large, I think, captains of industry would have been quite prepared, to pay this amount. And he says, I calculated, and my rough calculation of all the JSE listed companies, the 1% would have amounted to something like 11 billion rands.
But it goes further than that, Advocate Ntsebeza. And coming back to the government again, Dr. Marjorie Jobson, because when people did try to go out and seek reparations from at least some of the foreign conglomerates that were operating in this country at the time, again, it was our government that intervened in that.
I mean, Khulumani and us, we brought an action in the United States.
If you could just briefly tell us what happened there.
So when it became evident that there was going to be a lot of resistance to actually delivering reparations to victims, we looked with partners at other options and the role of multinational companies in breaking all the United Nations embargoes, in making sure we still got delivery of oil. There were 23 companies identified with a huge amount of research that was done. So the cases were brought against 23 multinationals who aided and abetted the perpetration of these gross violations by equipping this apartheid regime with the technology, with the money, with the weaponry to actually wage a reign of terror and the most severe political oppression that we've seen for decades, centuries actually. And the companies were very fearful of that case. Eventually, every time the case went through a process of being presented to a legal panel, the companies were whittled away, and finally the United States changed the law to say only human rights perpetrations that happen in US territory can come before their court going forward, which is a huge setback globally for actually securing protection of citizens in a just uprising against the most oppressive regime in the world. I think it was one of the worst because it legitimized everything they did, and the TRC unfortunately had to start with that apartheid was a legitimate system at the time, so we couldn't even use the arguments that it was a crime against humanity and a criminal enterprise because of I think the founding agreements.
Yes, but I mean, apropos what Marjorie is saying, what was shocking to us, because I was part of that case that was also litigated in the United States. What came shocking to us was the attitude of the then government, I think, in Parliament in 2003, and I was there. when the final report of the TRC was presented, because the Amnesty Committee continued long after, 1998. At that presentation, the president of the country, President Mbeki, condemned the actions of those of us who had litigated in the United States. And it had nothing to do with them. They did not implement the recommendations that we had made. We found that there was a basis for us to litigate elsewhere by exploiting, a piece of law or piece of legislation in the United States where a person could find a defendant anywhere in the world, bring it before the courts in the United States of America, and prosecute them for gross violations of human rights. And now we have a president of the country telling the world that we are people who are stirring trouble by carrying on with that kind of litigation, when, as I said, they had sat on their hands. Now we know from one of the prosecutors, Vusi Pikoli also has filed an affidavit where it says we were interfered with politically.
And I think this is what we are grappling with right now. Many people say the TRC as a process was a failure. Was the TRC a failure, or is it the actual failure to follow through that has scuppered what had been achieved at that stage? You will make up your mind, but let's take a look at some of your comments coming through. Some tweets, I believe we have, and we'll pull those up just to share with our guests as well. Dakalo says, in South Africa, the findings of a commission has no legal standing and do not automatically lead to criminal prosecution simply because they implicated those who are in power. So our commission of inquiries are not effective as their recommendations are not carried through. That's from Dakalo. And then another one here from Tao, who says the TRC was never intended to be the end point. It was meant to be just a little bit of a starting point. The great failure was what happened after the TRC. And this one's from Appa, and who says APLA members still languishing in jail, spies within liberation movements looming large, perpetrators of apartheid criminality benefiting, and victims still waiting for restorative justice. What a sham. So those some of the comments but I think I have to thank both of you for at least taking us somewhat behind the scenes, because one gets a sense, especially today, that for the most part, people are oblivious to some of the goings-on behind the scenes and who did what at what point, and why it is that we find ourselves only now with some tokenism of, okay, we'll act on the some 300 odd cases that were handed over to government. But we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much for stopping by, Dr. Marjorie Jobson from Khulumani Support Group, Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, former commissioner with the TRC, and the conversation should not stop here. And you can get in touch with us at Morning Live SABC, hashtag Morning Live, sending us your views still, because that's our question of the day, also premised on subjects such as the TRC and its recommendations and what has happened or not happened. And what does this mean? Where does this leave us as a country? It's time now for News with Leanne.